Very recently, I had pointed out to me in a comment that in this series on philosophical commitments and developments, I haven't talked about somebody who I've said at a number of points is quite an important author for me. And this was in response to something that was going around on Twitter where you put pictures of four thinkers who've influenced your own thought the most. And I put a number of different people, and one of them was Albert Camus. And so anyway, people pointed out, oh, that's very interesting. Which Camus do you like? But then somebody was like, so you've done all these other videos talking about, phases that you've had or what you really like about this thinker, why you keep going back to them. Why haven't you done one about Albert Camus? And it really is long overdue for a variety of reasons. And one of them, so I'm going to start out with this. You may find it quite interesting. And it may be something that you've actually heard me talk about in interviews or AMAs. Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus is the first philosophy book that I ever read. I'd, heard things about different philosophers. I think we read excerpts in classes. But the actual book, The Myth of Sisyphus, and other essays, by the way, it's the edition that wasn't just The Myth of Sisyphus, was something that I got from my uncle Aimé. He was living in his room in my grandparents' basement in Indiana, where I spent a lot of my summers, and we spent all of our, holidays, Easter, Christmas, those sorts of things. We'd get together with my family. So anyway, Aim was somebody who you've perhaps heard me talk about in the past. He suffered from bipolar disorder, and it was undiagnosed for a long time. He kind of kept to himself, listened to a lot of talk radio, long before talk radio was noxiously, hard right, and it was a bit more interesting. And he read a lot of books. And there were a lot of books to read because Grandpa and Grandma's house was right across from Uncle Hubert and Aunt Teresa's house, and Uncle Hubert had an entire library in his basement. So anyway, Aim had The Myth of Sisyphus among a whole bunch of other books. And I was sitting in there one day talking with him in the summer, and I had a big interest in Greek mythology and legends at the time. So I figured it was about Sisyphus, the actual person. And indeed, it does talk about that legendary character towards the very end of the book. So I asked Aim, can I borrow this from you? And he said, oh, you can have it. I really didn't understand it that well. Maybe you'll have better luck with it. And, fast forward, I didn't have much better luck with it. I probably understood about 1/10 of what I was reading, but it was pretty cool, to start out by saying things are absurd, that there's one big philosophical question, that's whether to kill yourself. I mean, that will grip a teenager in a way that perhaps much more academically oriented philosophy might not. So anyway, I read it, and, I read other philosophy books later on towards the end of high school. I read the other essays as well in it. And then I went off and, joined the Army, came out of it, and eventually went to college. And I brought the book with me. And you may have also heard me talk about this as well. The particular place that I went to in college in 1990, Lakeland College, only had two people teaching philosophy, and those two had a very skewed sense of the philosophical landscape. They were both old, near retirement, hadn't kept up on contemporary trends. They thought there were basically four things going on in philosophy: analytic philosophy, which they thought was going to die out anytime soon, process philosophy, Marxism, and then existentialism. And Camus He does say that he's not an existentialist. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But he is certainly within the, let's say, broad movement of existentialist philosophy and literature. He fits neatly into what we could call the third phase of it, where it becomes very much a French-dominated thing. So in any case, my professors, they didn't think that Camus wasn't an existentialist, and they taught him in some of their classes. So in intro class, we talked about some things, mostly again from the Myth of Sisyphus. Very early on, I got my hands on a copy of The Stranger, read that, reread the Myth of Sisyphus. So now I'm introduced to, like, we could call it the early phase of Camus' thinking. I was in a honors class. I want to say that was sophomore year. And we read a wide range of philosophy and novels and other things. And one of them was the novel The Plague. And now this is later work and more developed, more thought through, we could say, than some of the earlier stuff. And I found it captivating. And so I wanted to read more and more and more of Camus. And I did, because we had, fortunately, a lot of this stuff in the library. So, back then I reread the Myth of Sisyphus, probably understood 50% of it by then. I took a stab at reading The Rebel. I didn't understand a lot of that, in part because there's references to all sorts of authors who I hadn't read at the time. And I read my way through Camus' other novels and stories, and some of the other essays. And I came to really, by the time that I was finishing up in college, I really had a strong appreciation for Camus. I didn't see him as articulating any sort of systematic perspective. You generally don't expect existentialists to have a completely systematic perspective like, that of Kant or, Hegel or even Aristotle or, René Descartes or people like that. But there's a, overarching set of themes there. And I felt a greater affinity with Camus than I did with the other existentialists who I was reading, studying, thinking about at the time, particularly Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Søren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, and we read a little Dostoevsky. I don't think I paid much attention to Dostoevsky at the time. We read a little Heidegger. I couldn't make heads or tails of Heidegger back then, but Jaspers we read, and of course some Rilke as well. But I probably liked Camus the most. And if you'd asked me at the time what was that about, I would have said something like, I think that there's a real appreciation for humanity within his works and a willingness to say, here's where I take a stand. I might be wrong, but this is how things appear to me, and I'm willing to revise it later on. And so then, he was always kind of in the backdrop. I finished up my college. I also I felt like Camus had a sort of integrity to him that it wasn't totally lacking in these other thinkers, but it was greater in Camus. He was somebody who I could imagine like sitting down with and having good conversations about different matters over, some wine or coffee or whatever. So I always had him kind of in the background, and then, I finished college, started working. While I was in that year that I was working as a security guard and as a barista, and also worked in a gas station for a while, I was getting my French, up to par, you could say. I grew up learning some French as a kid and took a few classes, and then in college I kind of buckled down and learned how to properly, do the grammar, understand, read things, and all that. And so Camus was somebody, I reread The Stranger, very easy book to read in the way that it's written, and then went on to start reading other things as well, mostly novels, not so much the philosophy stuff. And then I went to graduate school, and by the time that I got to graduate school, they had a very different understanding of what the landscape of philosophy looked like. There was analytic philosophy, some of which was like, the history of analytic philosophy, some of which was like the contemporary cutting edge stuff like possible world semantics and all of that. And then there was continental philosophy. But continental philosophy by then was not really oriented around existentialism. It was felt like existentialism, that was something we leave behind. It was more for like, people who were into personal development or, guru types. The real cutting edge stuff was Derrida and Foucault and Deleuze and Lyotard and people like that, right? So I still was interested in Camus, and I would read him every once in a while. But in graduate school, he was kind of in the background for me. And then I finished and got out. I defended my dissertation, started teaching in Indiana State Prison with Ball State, moved on to other places. And I would go back and reread, mostly I would reread The Plague, occasionally The Fall. I didn't really read The Stranger that much until much later on when I did my videos on it. But I would reread The Myth of Sisyphus and take another stab at The Rebel and read some of the other things too. And so over time, I think part of it was I needed to actually mature as a reader and thinker and as a human being to more fully appreciate what he was saying. And a different Camus, who was always there, I just wasn't appreciating it, became more evident to me. That he was somebody who, could say on the one hand, hey, there are no pre-established meanings out there in the universe to find. There is this connection or disconnection of the absurd between what us human beings want, rationality, our desires, a world that doesn't fulfill that, and then the divorce between them. And yet that doesn't mean that justice or love or human dignity or integrity are just figments of our imagination. He thought there was really something worthwhile exploring there, and he had his characters do it, and he did it in his own works. And so, as I moved into my 30s and 40s and, became somebody not just in middle age, but with responsibilities, taking on more and more, I would say that my thinking expanded, and I was better able to understand more of what was going on in Camus' work. I'm not going to say I understand everything fully, but I was able to appreciate it better. And I shot videos in my 40s when I was doing that series on existentialist philosophy and literature, on his early works, on The Stranger and on The Myth of Sisyphus. And then I never got around to shooting on the other stuff because I kind of discontinued that series of longer lectures, which you can find in the channel if you want to. But I did that Glimpses of Existence talk series. So that would have been 2015. I was invited to give a set of 12 monthly talks at the Kingston Public Library. And so I decided to talk about existentialism. And Camus was somebody who I talked about towards the end. It might have actually been the final lecture, but I think I did it a little bit earlier than that. I did, 4 of the French thinkers, Camus, Sartre, de Beauvoir, and Gabriel Marcel. And rereading the Camus was very, very productive for me because I was reading like across the corpus to prepare for this session. And I saw all this stuff that maybe I'd taken notice of before, but then not followed through on. And I spent a lot of time going in particular through The Rebel. And you can see when you read the introduction to it that Camus has progressed. He has, he says explicitly, back then I thought the fundamental question posed by the absurd is that of suicide. Now, after World War II and moving into the Algerian conflict and decolonialization and all of that stuff, it is not suicide, it is murder. And our complicity or involvement in it, and we need to think this out, right? So, and then there's sort of bridge pieces. I reread, because I don't think I paid close enough attention the first time I read it earlier. I reread the Letters to a German Friend, and I was like, wow, this is powerful stuff. And that's written during the war in the 30s. Like the first one, the 40s, sorry. The first one is actually written in 43, when the war is starting to turn against the Germans, but, things could still go topsy-turvy, right? And, one of the things that I've really come to appreciate about Camus is he doesn't take any either like, well, my system says things have to be this way, so I'm going to declare this way. He doesn't take any answers like that, and he doesn't come up with any easy answers, and yet he still does commit himself as an author and as a person, as a human being. And he's aware of the complexity, not just of, say, human nature, if there is such a thing for him, but individual human beings. And I find that incredibly compelling. There's a decency to him that he never lost sight of. And I won't call it an optimism, but he's not a pessimistic person, right? He is opposed to pessimism or fatalism or just giving up and, the kind of gloomy type of the caricature of existentialism. He's not into that, right? And yet he thinks it's important to be realistic and recalibrate at each point and see whether you've gotten things wrong and engage in dialogue with other people and learn from them. And I think that's something that I find personally as a human being and as a philosopher, something that I would like to emulate. So you could say that Camus, is it that I took this idea from him and then ran with it? No, it's not that kind of influence that he's had on me. It's rather being somebody in the background, an interlocutor for a lot of my existence. And, he went from being kind of, I would say when I was an undergraduate, kind of like a hero type to me, to being somebody much, much closer. Somebody who I feel a kind of affinity with. And there are some big differences as well. I mean, I don't agree with him on quite a few things, but I respect him, if that makes sense. I would like to talk, before I bring this to a close, about the existentialist thing, right? So people will inevitably chime in anytime that you talk about Camus, and they'll be, especially if you're doing it in the context of existentialism, they'll say, Camus said he wasn't an existentialist. Well, yeah, so did a lot of people, and part of that was because his, for a while, collaborator and interlocutor, and then eventually, not an enemy, but certainly you could say a rival, Jean-Paul Sartre tried to take over existentialism, at least a definition of it, saying, you've got theistic and atheistic existentialism, and they're all about, existence precedes essence. And, it wasn't just Camus who said, I'm not an existentialist. Gabriel Marcel, who's the first person to use that term in French, when Sartre did that, he's like, I guess I'm not an existentialist then. Even though Gabriel Marcel was being called a Christian existentialist by Sartre, he's like, I guess I'm a Christian Socratic. Heidegger read the, existentialism as a humanism, and then wrote his letter on humanism, where he's like, I'm not an existentialist either. But that just means they weren't Sartrean existentialists. We have a much broader canvas. And Camus, who did he mean? Well, read the Myth of Sisyphus. He thinks that the existentialists are Kierkegaard, Lev Shestov, Jaspers, people like that, theistic existentialists. So when he says, I'm not an existentialist, I'm not making a leap into the absurd the way that these guys are, it's a certain kind of existentialism that he is distinguishing himself against. He also writes about Kafka, he writes about Dostoevsky. Both of them, he thinks, also make the leap in certain ways in some of their books. He writes about Nietzsche, also considered an existentialist, and he's much more positive about Nietzsche in the Myth of Sisyphus, less so in The Rebel, by the way. And so I think it makes good sense, particularly since he was so closely affiliated with them, to not be precious and say, oh, Camus was an absurdist. He wasn't an absurdist too either, by the way. He had a philosophy of the absurd, but he wasn't hanging out with these people who called themselves absurdists either. He was, broadly speaking, an existentialist. He's not one of the existentialists that he targets for criticism. So I do want to say a little bit about that. But to close this up, let's come back to the character of Camus. And, who knows what he would have developed into. You see these later works, and you're like, wow. There was some great stuff in his early works, but there's a kind of potential and promise that we're seeing not just glimpses of, but, much more developed aspects of as we go to, these later novels, his interest in Dostoevsky's The Possessed, which, by the way, is my favorite Dostoevsky work, The Rebel, and, some of the other things that he writes. And so, what would he have turned into? Again, we don't really know. It's interesting to see how closely he was following the world that's changing around him and his unwillingness to take easy positions. There's something in that I can deeply respect. At the same time, he thought you do have to take stands on things, even if you don't have complete knowledge. And so I think those are some things that will probably always endear him to me. And I think, here's where I'll end. I think that he's a very relevant thinker for our challenges and the world that we inhabit today. I think that he's probably underrated stock, and I'm looking forward to doing more work on him. I've already done, core concept videos covering the entirety of the Myth of Sisyphus. I've got plans to do Letters to a German Friend. Maybe down the line, The Rebel, we'll see. A lot depends on, how much I can get done. But I think that he's somebody who really is still worth engaging with, because I think he's still of great contemporary relevance. So I'll leave it off with that. If you got stories about your own connections with Camus, leave them in the comments. And if you got questions about what I've said here, you could ask those questions in the comments as well. But that's probably enough at this point.